For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1155, a bill ensuring that goods made with forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China do not enter the United States market and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks, include extraneous material on H.R. 1155.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in support of H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Prevention Act, introduced by my good friend, colleague, and chairman of the Rules Committee, McGovern. And let me also thank Speaker Pelosi for bringing this crucial measure to the floor and her unwavering dedication to human rights issues in China over the course of her public life. This necessary and bold measure reinforces this body's commitment to our values by responding to the PRC's human rights violations and imposing concrete costs on the PRC for its use of Uyghur forced labor. Since 2017, the People's Republic of China has systematically carried out mass detention, torture, political indoctrination, restrictions on religious practices, and inhumane atrocities against Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. We've seen the People's Republic of China expand its extensive program of repression and transform it into a system of state-sponsored forced labor. Under the guise of vocational training or poverty alleviation, authorities in Xinjiang have forced thousands of adults and children to work against their will and under threat of punishment to produce goods and raw materials that are then woven into international supply chains and into our homes. And according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, it has been conservatively estimated that more than 80,000 Uyghurs transferred out of Xinjiang to work in factories across China between the years of 2017 and 2019, with some of them being sent directly from detention centers. Some analysts estimate that over 100,000 ex-detainees in Xinjiang are working in conditions of forced labor today. And I've seen firsthand the benefits of the American companies engaging in China. Most American companies pay above market wages and have better corporate social responsibility practices than their domestic counterparts. But it would be inconsistent with the core and crucial American values for this body not to take a stand against forced labor and to stand up for the persecuted Uyghurs. Many brave companies have already spoken out and made ethical choices detrimental to their bottom line. And this bill ensures the corporate actors that have lived their lives, their values, are not at a competitive disadvantage in the American marketplace. This bill, which has passed the House before, prohibits the import of goods and merchandise from Xinjiang unless the importer can prove the products did not come from forced labor. It imposes sanctions on officials facilitating the use of forced labor against Chinese and ethnic minorities, add important financial disclosures for public companies that do business in the region, and calls for diplomatic strategy to address forced labor in Xinjiang. This is a straightforward bill. It signals that forced labor has no place on this planet. It signals that products made using forced labor on Xinjiang have no place in the American marketplace. In 2021, for any country to utilize forced labor systematically and to oppress and exploit a population is simply unconscionable. With the passage of this bipartisan measure, the House would hold accountable those responsible for perpetrating these heinous crimes that have irrevocably threatened the lives of over 1.8 million Uyghurs and Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, and ensure Americans and American companies are not complicit in the Chinese Communist Party's human rights atrocities. This legislation is critical to showing that we are putting human rights at the center of our foreign policy and economic policy. I support and urge my colleagues to do the same. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I want to start by thanking Chairman Meeks, Chairman McGovern for bringing this important human rights legislation to this floor. And it's high time. I want to start this debate with the simple truth that we cannot afford to forget. Truly free trade cannot involve slave labor. Today, the Chinese Communist Party is using the forced labor of the Uyghurs and other minorities to help bankroll its genocide against these very same groups. The repression taking place right now in Xinjiang is breathtaking in its scope and its brutality. It involves the detention of more than 1 million people in concentration camps. It also involves surveillance and attempted brainwashing on a massive scale. It involves breaking up families and taking children from their parents. And it involves forced sterilization and forced abortions. This should be a terrifying warning, not only to China's neighbors and to the American people, but also to the world. The Chinese Communist Party is fundamentally focused on expanding its power and its authoritarian style of government. It views things that it does not control, like religion, cultural identity, and the yearning of all people for freedom, as threats that must be destroyed. And because we've drawn the CCP into many of our most critical supply chains, it has the ability to hold our national security hostage while it uses U.S. consumers to subsidize its atrocities. As many as 1 in 5 cotton garments globally are potentially tainted with Uyghur slave labor. Last year alone, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized a 13-ton shipment of human hair that originated in Xinjiang's forced labor system. It's brazen and it's sickening. We must refuse to be complicit in the CCP's genocide against the Uyghurs, and for that reason, I support the measure before us today. And I wish we could have taken this up earlier. After sending a letter to the Speaker, we are finally at the day where we are now. Last Congress, this legislation went straight to the floor. 2 weeks ago, 10 members of the Foreign Affairs Committee joined me in a letter urging the Speaker to move this bill. I'm grateful that our message was received. But we could send this legislation to the President's desk today by taking up the Senate version. Instead, we're setting this bill up for further legislative gridlock, bypassing a conflicting version. Although I do applaud Chairman McGovern's efforts in this issue. So going forward, I hope the majority in both chambers will move this to final passage, regardless of pressure from the administration to not advance the American values we all share. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to yield 4 minutes to the sponsor of this bill, the representative from the great state of Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 4 minutes.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to thank Chairman Meeks for yielding me the time and for his incredible leadership on this issue. And I also want to thank Ranking Member McCall. You know, Mr. Speaker, many products used every day by people all over our country, including clothing, food, and shoes, are made using forced labor. The forced labor of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities held by the Chinese government across a network of internment camps. It has been illegal to import forced labor products into the United States for more than 90 years. But it is exceedingly difficult to spot them, since Chinese producers often mix together products that are the result of both involuntary and voluntary labor. Moreover, the lack of Chinese government transparency and the police state atmosphere in Xinjiang make auditing of product sourcing unreliable, if not impossible, according to the administration's Xinjiang Supply Chain Business Advisory. Mr. Speaker, the imperative to act is clear. This is not a partisan issue. It is a human rights issue. It is a moral issue. There is already strong, diverse, bipartisan, and bicameral support for this legislation on both sides of the Capitol. That includes my colleagues on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, Representative Chris Smith and Senator Marco Rubio, the author of the Senate bill. And I, too, want to especially thank Speaker Nancy Pelosi for her longtime advocacy for human rights in China and for her leadership in getting this bill to the House floor today. I want to thank Chairman Neal and Chairman Meeks and Chairwoman Waters for their support and their committees. The House of Representatives passed this bill in September of 2020 by a vote of 406 to 3. But sadly, the Senate did nothing. It never took it up. The Senate now passed a version of this bill in July. It's time for us to get this done. 2 years ago, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, of which I serve as the co-chair, held a hearing and an expert roundtable and issued a groundbreaking staff report. This legislation would not be possible without the hardworking staff of that commission. Our findings of systematic and widespread forced labor in Xinjiang are based on testimony from camp detainees, satellite imagery of factories being built in internment camps, and public and leaked Chinese government documents. Forced labor was one of the justifications cited by the State Department, first by Secretary Pompeo, and then reiterated by Secretary Blinken in determining that the Chinese government was committing genocide against Uyghurs and members of other Muslim ethnic minority groups. Forced labor was listed by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in its November 2021 report, finding that the Chinese government had committed crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act prohibits imports from Xinjiang to the U.S. by creating a rebuttable presumption that all goods produced in the region are made with forced labor unless U.S. Customs and Border Protection certifies by clear and convincing evidence that goods were not produced with forced labor. Mr. Speaker, in 2 months, the Chinese government will host the Winter Olympics in the middle of a genocide. This is unconscionable. We asked the International Olympic Committee to postpone and move the games. They refused. Instead, the IOC made ANTA, a Chinese company implicated in Xinjiang slave labor, its official sportswear uniform supplier. And I'm pleased that the Biden administration has decided not to send American diplomats to the Olympics. But Congress needs to do its part by passing this bill before the Olympics start. We must take a clear moral position to stand with those who are suffering from forced labor and not with the Chinese government, the IOC, and the big corporations who profit off the exploitation of slave labor. Shame on them. No more business as usual. We must pass and put into law the Uyghur Forced Prevention Act. And I urge all my colleagues to support this. If the United States of America stands for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. I yield back my time.
From Massachusetts yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a statement on this bill from the ranking member of the Committee on Ways and Means, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady.
Without objection.
Thank you. And with that, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights. He also has co-chaired the China Commission and has been a champion for human rights in China for 3 decades.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank my good friend for yielding. I thank Mr. McCall for his extraordinary leadership on China, including his commission that has made many, many recommendations. I want to thank Chairman Meeks for his leadership as well, and of course to Chairman McGovern, with whom I've worked on this bill. Mr. Speaker, I chaired a Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing in May entitled China, Genocide, and the Olympics, which helped further underscore why H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which I've co-sponsored with Jim McGovern, is so important and so necessary. At that hearing, we heard testimony from Rehan Asat, whose brother Ekbar, a Muslim Uyghur, at last report is still incarcerated in a concentration camp in Xinjiang. Ekbar is a tech engineer, entrepreneur, media founder, and a philanthropist who won recognition both inside of China and outside. Indeed, our State Department thought so highly of him, he was part of the International Visitors Leadership Program. But upon his return, because he was a Muslim Uyghur, the Chinese authorities arrested and disappeared him into a concentration camp where he has remained for 5.5 years. And what happens, Mr. Speaker, to those swallowed up in these horrific concentration camps? That was something we heard about at another Lantos Commission hearing this past July, where Guzera, a survivor, told us what goes on each and every day. In addition to a horrific firsthand description of unspeakable physical abuse, organized forced prostitution, rape, and every gross violation of human rights imaginable, she also gave a firsthand account of a forced labor factory at which she made gloves for export for a year and a half. Gozera is one of the lucky ones because she was released when Radio Free Asia broadcast her plight to the world. Mr. Speaker, there are millions of stories like hers waiting to be told, truly nightmarish accounts of President Xi Jinping's genocide. And make no mistake about it, this is Xi Jinping's genocide. He is personally responsible, having ordered it. The rape and sexual abuse of women, being held in internment camps, so-called internment camps, forced abortion and involuntary sterilization to prevent the birth of Uyghur children, are in direct violation of Article 2D of the UN Genocide Convention, which states in part that genocide includes imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. Forced labor at a massive scale that allows Chinese companies to profit big time from modern-day slavery is also absolutely pervasive in Xinjiang. Documents obtained by the New York Times and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists exposed how cruel these plans are, originating again with Xi Jinping, who early next year will be hosting the Olympic Games, which is outrageous. The leaked documents show how Xi directed the crackdown, saying that the Communist Party must put the organs of dictatorship to work and show absolutely no mercy in dealing with Uyghurs and other predominantly Muslim minorities. In one speech, President Xi said that they should show no mercy and that the weapons of the People's Democratic Dictatorship must be yielded without any hesitation or wavering. Mr. Speaker, I am deeply concerned by a report from Josh Rogin in the Washington Post just last week, stating how the Biden administration and Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman sought to undermine the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which passed the Senate last July and the House last Congress 406-3. According to Josh Rogin, Biden administration officials have been quietly telling lawmakers to slow down. Sherman made it clear that the administration prefers a more targeted and deliberative approach to determining which goods are the products of forced labor, close quote. We have no access, Mr. Speaker, to the concentration camps in Xinjiang. We have no idea the supply chains. It's closed. It's a dictatorship. There are no on-site inspections. And again, we are talking genocide against these Muslims who are being wiped off the face of the earth. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act prohibits imports from Xinjiang to the United States by creating a rebuttable presumption. And that is the core of this bill, that all goods produced in the region are made with forced labor unless U.S. Customs and Border Protection certifies by clear and convincing evidence that goods were not produced with forced labor. So the rebuttal presumption is the key to this legislation, and it is very workable. As my good friend and colleague noted, cotton and solar panels and so many other things are produced there. We need to stop them from coming here. And again, if they can prove the manufacturers...
One minute.
Oh, I thank my friend.
I yield the gentleman next for a minute.
Gentleman
If the
is
companies
recognized
can
for 1
prove that it is not made by forced labor, not made as part of this genocide, then it would be welcomed here. But we know that's unlikely to happen, and so my hope is that we will unite, Republican and Democrat, Democrat and Republican, around this bill and get it to the president as soon as humanly possible. Delay is denial. People are being slaughtered each and every day in Xinjiang, and we can do something maybe not a whole lot, but something to mitigate and stop it. I yield back, and I thank you.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I proudly yield 2 minutes to the representative from the great state of New York, from the Ways and Means Committee, Tom Suozzi.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to everyone who's worked so hard on this, including Chairman McGovern. I stand before you as chair of the Congressional Uyghur Caucus and as a member of the Congressional Executive Commission on China to support passage of the bipartisan Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We need to wake up from our torpor. It's been reported for years, but I don't think most Americans realize exactly what's going on in China. It was almost 50 years ago that Nixon went to China, and we've always believed that the more the Chinese government and the people were exposed to the United States and the West and our way of life and our democracy and our economic system, the more they'd become like us, the more they'd adopt concepts of freedom, of expression, free markets, minority rights. Well, that simply hasn't happened. Everyone in this body has seen reliable reports, clear documentation of crimes against humanity. Forced labor, forced sterilization, mass surveillance, government-run detention camps, mass detention, sexual violence, and torture against the Uyghur people. The Chinese Communist Party is even forcing people to eat pork during Ramadan, even though it violates people's religion. It's hard to imagine that in today's world that forced labor camps are happening, and we know about it. And today, we're standing up to do something about it. The Chinese Communist Party must be held accountable. We have rules in place now that say you can't use forced labor, but this bill is a major step forward in mandating that everything that comes out of Xinjiang in China will be presumed to be using forced labor, and therefore ineligible to be sold into the U.S. supply chain. This is going to have a tremendous impact. An overwhelming amount of cotton in the world comes from China, for example. 84% of that cotton comes from China, comes from the Xinjiang region. Some people are going to say, oh my gosh, if we don't do business with Xinjiang, then the cost of products are going to go up. Well, that's too damn bad. This should shock everyone's conscience.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for additional 30 seconds.
We have to do everything we can to stand up for our values. The world is watching us, and it starts with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act becoming law. Let's do this, and let's do it together. We recognize here in our country that we went through a period of slavery. That's why it's so offensive to us now to see slavery actually happening in the world as we speak, where both administrations, the prior administration and this administration, have both said this is genocide. Standing up together in a bipartisan way is so important. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, a member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Republican lead McCall and Chairman Meeks. You're a force in the House gymnasium. You're a force on the House floor, and I appreciate you, brother. The Chinese Communist Party does anything it can to get ahead of the United States, Mr. Speaker. It steals our intellectual property and uses Uyghur slave labor to manufacture products. It's threatening the freedom of folks from Taiwan to Hong Kong. Our government needs to stand up to them. Today we are acknowledging some of the Chinese Communist Party's horrible behaviors. It is not enough. Additional action is needed, Mr. Speaker. The Chinese Communist Party knows there are no consequences for its behavior. That needs to change. It starts with the Biden administration. They need to do more than just finger-wagging to effectively counter China. This administration needs to make it clear to the Chinese Communist Party that bad behavior will be met with action, not empty words. President Biden also needs to set aside his climate agenda when addressing the Chinese Communist Party. His administration tried to kill the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act because the Uyghurs mine the polysilicon for our solar panels. It's gross that this administration wants to let Uyghur slavery slide to advance its climate agenda. I'm glad we have these bills on the floor today. It's a start, but more work needs to be done. I hope in the Foreign Affairs Committee, both parties can work together and hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, and I yield the remainder of my time to my dear friend, Republican lead McCall.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I now proudly yield 2 minutes to the representative from the great state of Oregon, Representative Blumenauer.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
from Oregon is recognized.
I appreciate your courtesy. You know, Congress passed a law almost a century ago prohibiting the importation of goods made with forced labor. But, you know, it was really never enforced. That changed in 2016 potentially when we passed legislation to eliminate the consumptive demand loophole that allowed people a way around. Well, it's time that we finished the job. Nothing is more chilling than what the Chinese are doing to the Uyghur people. I've chaired meetings of our trade subcommittee, and it is really appalling. It's Orwellian in terms of what they are doing to detain Uyghurs in internment, re-education, slave labor camps. The international concern the Chinese think will just remain on the sideline. Now, there are many American companies that are attempting to deal with this, but we need to do more. We need to strengthen their resolve, and we need to be able to get the attention of the Chinese government. A stronger regime is absolutely necessary. Crimes against humanity require a response. We must not just vote our support for the Uyghur people and other minorities across China. We need to make sure that we're clear about who gets the benefit of the doubt. More than 1 million Uyghurs have been enslaved, half of them forced to harvest cotton, one of Xinjiang's region's largest exports. When American consumers buy a shirt, they shouldn't have questions about whether or not that was made with forced labor. I strongly support this legislation to ensure that American dollars aren't inadvertently contributing to forced labor. That's the language that the Chinese understand, denying them access to our markets and making sure that people are responsible for their supply chains. This legislation, I think, is a great start. I'm pleased that there is bipartisan support for it. I hope we enact it, and then we work together to make sure that it is enforced. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, a member of the Committee on Ways and Means.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you to the Majority Leader. Mr. Speaker, China is a global thief. We all know it. They steal American intellectual property. They steal American jobs using currency manipulation, illegal subsidies, product dumping to kill American competition. And worst of all, they produce products with slave labor. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 1155, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. H.R. 1155's central provision establishes a rebuttable presumption that all goods made in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region are produced with forced labor. Since 2017, China has arbitrarily detained and persecuted over 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities in an extrajudicial mass re-education camps in Xinjiang. We know that China is seeking to profit from this oppression by subsidizing companies to build factories near these mass internment sites. H.R. 1155 leverages the power of our enormous market to send China a message that it cannot use its policies of repression to subsidize its exports. We must work with our allies to ensure that all global markets are closed to the products of Chinese theft and repression. A core and essential provision of this bill is a rebuttable presumption that leads to an import prohibition. In 2016, the Ways and Means Committee led the way on a bipartisan basis in eliminating the consumptive demand loophole from the outright ban on products made with forced labor in Section 307 of the 1930 Tariff Act. A few years later, we have worked with our USMCA partners to extend the U.S. ban on products produced with forced labor throughout North America. We are now leading the world in combating forced labor in Xinjiang.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Gentleman, additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
For that reason, we wish that our Democratic colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee had worked with us to update the bill from the version that passed 14 months ago to ensure that it establishes the most effective mechanism for blocking imports from Xinjiang while providing much-needed clarity to facilitate trade by good actors. Just as importantly, we know that China has anticipated this ban by expanding this practice beyond Xinjiang. We need to work closely with our colleagues in the Senate to ensure that the version of the bill that becomes law can better assist importers to identify and proactively eradicate goods produced with forced labor from their supply chains, whether they arise in Xinjiang or in other locations. This bill is just the beginning, but it signals a strong signal to China that it cannot launder its policies of persecution and repression in a global market. I yield back.
Gentleman from South Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I probably yield 1 minute to the representative from the great state of Virginia, Representative Wexton.
Gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Meeks, Speaker Pelosi, and Chairman McGovern for bringing this important legislation to the floor and shining a light on the atrocities taking place in Xinjiang. I represent the largest Uyghur Muslim diaspora in the U.S., and this legislation is critically important to the Uyghur community. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of this legislation that will prohibit the importation of goods from Xinjiang unless it can be proven by clear and convincing evidence that they were not made with forced labor. Despite international condemnation, the Chinese government's brutal campaign of repressive surveillance, mass detention, forced labor, and even genocide is rapidly expanding, and we must take steps to ensure that U.S. companies and consumers are not complicit in the abuses. This legislation will hold the PRC accountable for these heinous acts and will make it clear that the U.S. will not turn a blind eye to the plight of the Uyghurs. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentlelady from Virginia yields back. The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I know there's another bill by Senator Rubio. I hope this bill, when it passes, can be worked out in the Senate, and I hope the administration will not slow roll this important measure, as has been reported. Out of this region, we have batteries and solar panels. When Secretary John Kerry testified, he admitted that Xinjiang solar panel production presents a problem for U.S. climate strategy, and I agree with him. In recent years, the world has stood by as the Chinese Communist Party has detained more than 1 million ethnic minorities in concentration camps where they are tortured, brainwashed, and put to forced labor. This is all part of a deliberate program by the CCP to wipe out their ethnic identity, their religion, and their culture. Anything that might compete with the Communist Party for their loyalties and affection. We have a moral duty to speak out against these horrifying crimes, but we have an even greater duty to avoid funding this genocide by paying for slave labor in Xinjiang. Many American companies have built their businesses on values that include respect for basic human rights. The United States must continue to lead the world in setting corporate responsibility standards. There can be no longer business as usual with China. China is watching, and the world is watching. So with that, I support this bill, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am happy that this bipartisan effort dealing with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is an opportunity for this body to send a resounding message to the world that we're engaged in strategic competition with China around the world, and our stance on this issue, I believe, will define our system as better. But I must make some comments. One, the comment that President Biden is holding this up. Well, I'm the chair of this committee. He's never told me to hold up anything. In fact, he wants to move forward. In fact, it's President Biden who has sanctioned officials responsible for genocide and issued supply chain advisory in Xinjiang. Fact of the matter is, I think our bill is far superior. You go to the Senate side, the Senate says this should take 300 days to stop. Our bill says 120 days. For me, this is a personal situation. So I would wish that some of my colleagues who rightfully want to make sure that we send a strong message to the world that we're not going to stand for genocide, we're not going to stand for slave labor. But it's best if they would join us about injustice in America. It's best if we fought together to make sure that when President Trump talked about a Muslim ban in the United States of America, that wasn't Joe Biden. We can't do it in America. That's the best way to lead. When we talk about moving, I want to condemn it everywhere. Dr. King said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So we should lead by example, collectively. We should lead by going forward with voting rights. We should lead by talking about reparations for those that were enslaved in America. We should lead by talking about the genocide that took place to Native Americans. We should lead to talk about the injustice in housing. We should lead by talking about civil rights. So we've got to come together and stop it everywhere. And that's what this bill does. It sends a strong message. And I want to be that example. This just happens to be personal. So I had to say it. And I know that my colleagues, to me, in that regards, because I don't like to put politics in these things, but I do like to tell the truth. Mr. Speaker, we're going to work together. And we got some bills that we're going to, and I want to thank, especially Mr. McCall. I got to say this, too, in closing. I got to say this in closing. Because Mr. McCall is my friend. And we work very closely together. And I know the spirit and his heart. And he stands up. And I look forward on this committee to continue to do that. And what I'm going to do, Mr. Speaker, I want to yield the balance of my time. 1 minute. I want to yield 1 minute to the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, the Honorable Nancy Pelosi.
The gentleman yields. The gentlelady from California, Speaker of the House, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for the recognition. I salute the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee for his leadership in bringing this legislation to the floor. It's historic, and I want to join him in saluting Mr. McCall, who has been a champion for human rights. We've worked together for years on these subjects. So thank you both for your leadership. As has been recognized earlier, Mr. Speaker, this week marks a momentous milestone in human history. 73 years ago this week, tomorrow actually, the international community convened in Paris to approve the United Nations Genocide Convention. In doing so, the world forged an historic commitment to always condemn and combat the crime of genocide, which they defined 2 years prior as, quote, a denial of the right of existence, which, quote, shocks the conscience of mankind and is, quote, a matter of international concern. Today, in some ways, we are falling short on that promise. In its latest human rights report, Our own State Department has definitively declared that the barbaric oppression of the Uyghurs by the government of China amounts to genocide. We salute the administration for that recognition. And new research at the United States Holocaust Museum sheds light on those crimes, with a survivor describing Beijing's intentions as, quote, to make us slowly disappear, so slowly that no one would notice. Indeed, the erasure of the Uyghurs is so precisely the definition of genocide from 3/4 of a century ago. And that is why, with a strong bipartisan package of legislation we will pass today, the House takes yet another bold bipartisan step to counter these crimes against humanity. You have us honoring the challenge to our conscience, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member McCall. Congress and the country are grateful to the relentless leaders of the legislation before us. And at the helm of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, as well as the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Chairman Jim McGovern has long served as a voice for the voiceless, not only in China, but around the world. With his Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, we are taking a decisive action against the exploitation of the Uyghur people. We are stepping up to the plate. I salute again Congressman Michael McCall with a resounding resolution condemning the genocide of the Uyghurs in China. And thank you to Congresswoman Jennifer Waxton with her resolution demanding that Beijing immediately guarantee the safety and freedom of tennis star Peng Shuai. Thanks also to Chairs Gregory Meeks, Richie Meehl, and Maxine Waters for their long-standing leadership in the House's fight against forced labor. Put together, this legislation, which we will pass today, makes it unequivocally clear the House's firm commitment to human rights in China, and does so in a bipartisan way. And that has always been the case over time. Mr. Smith, Chris Smith, and I have been working on these issues for decades together with others, Frank Wolf, who was here before him, but many on both sides of the aisle. Right now, Beijing is orchestrating a brutal and accelerating campaign of repression against the Uyghur people and other Muslim minorities. In Xinjiang and across China, millions are enduring outrageous human rights abuses, from mass surveillance and disciplinary policing to mass torture, including solitary confinement and forced sterilizations, intimidation of journalists and activists who have dared to expose the truth, and the government of China's exploitation of forced labor reaches across the oceans to our shores and across the world. They always say that the most horrible form of torture to a prisoner or somebody in one of these camps is to say to them, nobody knows you're even here. Nobody even cares about you. We want those people, the Uyghurs and others repressed in China, to know that we do care about them. We know many of them by name, and we will never forget our responsibility to act upon the actions that the Chinese government is engaged in. That's why the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act employs America's great economic might to combat this brutality and hold the perpetrators accountable, blocking certain imports produced with forced labor, leveling sanctions against the perpetrators, imposing disclosure requirements on companies engaged in Xinjiang. And this strong bipartisan legislation, we're better able to fight forced labor. We shine a bright light on this pattern of abuse, and we send Beijing a clear message. This genocide must end now. As we focus on this genocide against the Uyghurs, we must also remember Beijing's decades-long assault on human rights. Those of us who have long been in this fight for human rights in China have seen a regime of terror and repression that has only intensified, from Tibet to Taiwan, to assaults to basic freedoms in Hong Kong and beyond, to jailing of journalists and detaining of dissidents, and more. In the Congress for decades, we have taken strong bipartisan action fighting for human rights in China. That is why in 1991, Democrats and Republicans together stood up together for free speech during a visit to Tiananmen Square, just 2 years after the government's infamous crackdown. That is why in 1993, in a bipartisan way, we convinced the world that China's dismal record on human rights disqualified the nation from hosting the 2000 Olympic Games. That is why in 2000, I took to this floor to urge my colleagues to block China from the World Trade Organization, arguing that we should not put deals ahead of ideals. And China has not honored the agreement. That is why in 2015, working together, we had a congressional delegation to Tibet to see the aspirations in the eyes of the school children who have endured China's and Beijing's intimidation. And that is why in 2019, working together, we sounded the alarms as the Chinese government locked up pro-democracy demonstrators in Hong Kong. Democrats and Republicans, House and Senate, have come together to enact strong policies standing up for human rights in China, including the Tibet Policy and Support Act, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, all enacted into law, signed into law. And for decades, many of us have fought against normal trade, what they call normal trade relations with China, because as the world's strongest economy, America has a moral duty to tie our trade relations with human rights. When China joined the WTO 20 years ago this week, the world gave Beijing a blank check, prospering from its abuses while simply hoping it would change its behavior. Many of us knew then, as we know today, that this approach was fated for failure, and today's legislation will help right this wrong. But we must respond with more than legislation. We must show leadership. As House Speaker, I applaud and support President Biden's strong leadership in announcing there will be no official U.S. presence at the 2022 Winter Olympics. Allowing a country with an abysmal human rights record to host the Games makes a mockery of the Olympic Charter, which states that the Games should seek to foster, quote, respect for universal and fundamental ethical principles. Make no mistake, our athletes can and should be celebrated, but this year we should celebrate them from home. They can be there, we should be home. As noted when I called for the diplomatic boycott last May, the world must not reward more than 3 decades of abusive and repressive actions by the Chinese government by giving our official imprimatur to China. And I thank Mr. McCall for his leadership, particularly in calling out the Olympic Committee for making this choice. Mr. Speaker, today we have an opportunity to force further progress in the fight for human rights in China, a fight that many of us have been extraordinarily proud to help lead over our careers in Congress. Because if we do not speak out for human rights in China because of commercial or economic ties, we lose all moral authority to speak out against human rights violations anywhere in the world. And we must never fail to live up to our sacred duty to safeguard the dignity and worth of every person and build a better future for generations to come. Proudly, this legislation, all of it, Mr. McCall's, Mr. McGovern's, Ms. Wexton's, leadership of the chair, Mr. Meeks, and ranking member, Mr. McCall of the committee, that's why it's earned overwhelming bipartisan support. Thank you, Mr. McCall. When we passed it in the House last year, and I hope we will do so again this year. With that, I urge a strong vote for the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the other legislation that is before us this afternoon, and do so asking for a very strong bipartisan vote so that we know that we will have the numbers to send a message to the Chinese government that this is bipartisan, bicameral on both sides of the Capitol, and a view shared by the President of the United States. With that, I ask for, and I vote all around and yield back the balance of my time.
The yields. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
So, and I just will say these last ones, because I also want to thank Mr. Smith, just as indicated by the Speaker, who has, from the time that I've been in Congress, it has been his focus on human rights around the world. And as the Speaker has indicated, and as I indicated with Mr. McCall, and you'll see coming up, there's other bills that we've worked on collectively, leaving politics out of it, focused on leading the world. And that's what I look forward to, locking arms, sending that message around the world that we're not going to allow slave labor to flourish, to exist on this planet. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Question is on, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1155 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. That was well
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise?
A recorded vote. I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings are postponed.